transition now to our adult formation program, and so I would invite Alex Yank and Peter Habib to please come forward. Alex and Peter are going to be leading our conversation today, but as we transition to their program and we get the technology set up, I invite you to please join me in prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O God, who embraced us with perfect love and made us your people when we were yet strangers to you, be present with all refugees, immigrants, and displaced people throughout the world. May they know the consolation of your presence and the liberating power of your love. Then give us grace, we pray, to extend ever wider your embrace in a world of exclusion until all your children are knit together as beloved family in the perfect love that is your very heart. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who was displaced among us and who now lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen. Amen.
Alex and Peter, I invite you to please come forward and maybe just give a little bit of background information about your work and about the work that we've been doing as a committee, and then we'll get started.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure, and a cause for a little bit of anxiety to speak in front of people. But I'm reminding myself that you guys are my people. So I'm very glad to be here. Really, thank you to Mother Carmi for asking us to do this. For a little bit of context, we'll both kind of introduce ourselves and explain like why it is that we're the people up here leading a three-part discussion on refugees, immigrants, and newcomers, and sort of where we find ourselves in this current moment and our understanding of what our faith calls us to do. So in my day job, I am the Assistant Director of Youth and Immigrant Services at an organization called Inspiritus, which is a refugee and immigrant services organization, among other things, based here in Atlanta, Georgia. So we do refugee resettlement in Atlanta, Savannah, Birmingham, and Nashville, or I maybe should say did. We hope to continue doing refugee resettlement in Atlanta, Savannah, Birmingham, and Nashville. In my role, I oversee our programs related to unaccompanied immigrant children, foreign-born survivors of human trafficking, asylum seekers exiting detention, as well as asylum seekers who find themselves in Atlanta with no resources, and refugee K through 12 youth programs across 3 sites. So sort of a hodgepodge, but this has been the work of my career. I've been there for 9 years. It's where I did my first internship when I was getting my master's degree in social work, and that first internship completely changed my life and just charted pretty much like the path for realizing what I had an inkling that I was maybe put here to do. And so I love talking about this. It's deeply important in my life, and I love any opportunity to greater synthesize my faith and what it is I do 9 to 5 or beyond 9 to 5. So
That's great. Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Habib. Thank you again, Carmi, and that beautiful prayer to open us. And it's been wonderful to work with Alex and be part of the refugee ministry here at Epiphany, which we can touch upon as well. I'm involved in...
Peter, it's probably just me.
Yeah.
But is the microphone working? Or and if not...
should I be closer to this one?
It's so worth for both of you all to...
focus on the enunciate. Yeah.
We got it.
Not enunciate.
Yeah.
Just old people wow.
Thank you, Bobby. So my name is Peter Habib, and I'm just finishing my PhD at Emory in anthropology. Thank you. And part of my... Sorry, Bobby.
Where are you going? And I won't interrupt you.
Thank you, Bobby. Starting in August, I have a postdoc at Harvard for a year. So I'll be moving up to Boston. Bobby just wants to embarrass me. Thank you. But my research brought me to Lebanon for a year and a half. I did field work, many of you know. And my research looked at kind of squarely questions of refugee life in Lebanon. kind of broader issues of the efforts of water provision for assisting refugees. But Lebanon holds the most refugees per capita out of any country in the world. About a third of the population of Lebanon are displaced people, kind of pales in comparison to any other country. And so the kind of questions that we're talking about today are certainly kind of fundamental to the research I've been doing for the past 7 years or so, and I can come at it maybe from a bit more of a kind of academic, theoretical perspective at times, but I'm also excited to share some of my research fieldwork in Lebanon, and as we explore these kind of big questions. Do we start with an overview? Or?
Yeah. So sort of to give just a framework for what we're trying to do here, we've been ambitious, so I don't delude myself to thinking we'll be able to cover everything we hope to, but we thought today it would be helpful to sort of give a historical context and framework, like what is a refugee, what is the history that has sort of created this condition and status, some theological considerations, and then next week we want to talk about the sort of nuts and bolts of the actual refugee resettlement process, what that looks like here in the US, and then where we are in this current moment, because I think most folks generally know there have been some really drastic changes since the change in administration in January that have really dire consequences for those who are waiting to come and for those who have just arrived. And so to give more of a glimpse of exactly what's happening. And then the third session will actually just be me. Peter's worked hard enough. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the current moment for other newcomers, asylum seekers, and detainees. Talk about some of the experiences I have had on a trip to the US-Mexico border, the state of immigration detention in the US, which is greatly increasing, and so focus more on non-refugee newcomers. So just to give sort of a frame for what we're trying to do here. And what I want to do, I hope this works right out the gate. I thought it would be helpful to start with something a little emotional to sort of get us into this space. This is a poem, many of you have probably heard of it before, Home by Warsan Shire, who is a British Somali poet who writes about the refugee experience. And I want to give, and not in a laughable way, I do want to give sort of a content warning. There's strong experiences written in this poem, and so it makes me cry pretty much every time, but it is so powerful, so I wanted to share it with everybody first.
No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burned threads into your neck. And even then you carried the anthem under your breath. Only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck, feeding on newspaper, unless the miles traveled mean something more than the journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison because prison is safer than a city on fire. No one could take it, no one could stomach it, no one's skin would be tough enough. How do the words, the dirty looks roll off your backs? Maybe because the blow is softer than a limb torn off, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child's body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg. Forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. Thank you.
Some of that included real footage. There we go. Some of that included real footage of people fleeing Ukraine and other places. And sorry to start us by taking us down, but I think every time I hear that poem and think of those words, it creates proximity in me and makes it no longer feel like a problem somebody over there is having. I feel it in that moment, and I think one of the greatest calls for us in this time is a sense of proximity to the lived experience of those who have gone through this, because they're our brothers and sisters and our neighbors and our friends. So thank you for bearing with me.
Yeah. So we wanted to start with a kind of a very brief history of modern humanitarianism, and I think we come to the idea of humanitarianism with assumptions that it's always kind of been this almost primordial aspect of human life, that we have welcomed the stranger in various ways, and all of this is true, of course. Migration is fundamental to the human experience, but the kinds of institutions that we have and the formal rules that we have really have stemmed from the past 100 years, 150 years or so. And much of the questions of modern humanitarianism are questions of borders and nation states, which, as we see it today, are really the product of 200 years. And I'm happy to go through some of these larger discussions, but there have been many ways that we've structured human societies, and the ones that we have today are actually very kind of new and modern. But we can trace efforts of caring for displaced people really to the foundation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which stems specifically out of Europe, out of wars that were happening in Europe in the 1860s. And this was kind of the initial collection of different countries coming together to try to care for those that are displaced from conflict. But the institutions we have today, the UNHCR, which stands for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, you see the logo here, that is the main body that oversees all refugees on a global level. All of this really stems out of World War II. It's all a product of the displacement that happens in Europe during World War II, and the kind of formation of the Declaration of Human Rights, which as part of human rights that are attributed to all humans includes kind of the right of safety, the right to seek asylum, to claim asylum, claim protections and displacement. And then UNHCR is founded in 1950. So before this, there really wasn't actually a formal body that existed in the world to care for displaced peoples. It was maybe up to local communities or countries if they were willing to accept and such. But there weren't formal obligations. So this was, again, it was really kind of focused just on Europe primarily. And it was formalized in what's called the 1951 Refugee Convention, where countries came together to agree to assist displaced people after World War II. And 1951 convention was really specifically about Europe and World War II. It said basically the events that transpired before 1951. But these institutions were at the same time kind of designed initially to care for all people that were displaced. So there was an update in 1967 to care for anybody that's displaced from war. So in theory, this is the body, this is the kind of architecture, the scaffolding of institutions that we have, which is also to say that the scales of displacement that we see today are quite different than what occurred after World War II. It's certainly more of a global question than a regional one. And there's a lot of lack of kind of assistance and provision of formal protections as a result. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's also worth noting, just to add on that in the United States, a pivotal moment also occurred in 1980 with the formation of the Refugee Act, which was one of the enduring legacies of Jimmy Carter. And so we just recently celebrated that anniversary. Wait, not 1980. Yes. I got there. And so that was really a method, a formal act to create a refugee resettlement pathway in the United States. And that was really primarily to resettle Vietnamese refugees and other folks who were the sort of collateral damage of our prolonged conflict in Vietnam. And so, I was actually honored to go attend an event at the Carter Center recently celebrating that anniversary and his legacy. And some of us sort of commented, we miss him, but we're sort of glad he's not here right now to see where we're at, because I think it would break his heart. So who is a refugee? And we're going to talk about the sort of United Nations definition, because I think we can get into semantical differences, and we're going to talk more about meaning. But the United Nations defines a refugee as someone who has been forced to flee their country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution, well-founded as in they have to prove it, fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so, again, in a way that they can prove imminent danger. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are the leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries.
So part of this, so we were just talking about a kind of formal UN label that is also, this is part of the 1951 convention. Different states have signed on to the 1951 convention. Various states haven't signed on to the 1951 convention, which is important to note. Some countries in the Middle East, South Asia, for example. But according to this kind of claim, this definition we just shared, the label refugee is a condition. It's a formal condition that you can prove. Oh goodness, yes. Yes. Okay. So it's a condition of experience, I should say. It's not. There are ways you can prove it, but we should say it's a kind of a shared experience. But to actually be given the label refugee, to be given the protections afforded by 1951, you have to go through various screening processes, various formal processes to prove that condition. So the label refugee actually becomes a status and not just a condition. Right, so we can kind of think of the definition of what a refugee is and the ideal of that and all the people that could fit under that. But to actually claim that label, you have to fulfill various other processes, kind of formal processes to then have a status given to you. Well, you'll get an ID card, you'll be registered, you'll have various protections that countries that have signed on to these conventions are obligated to provide, right? So there is a kind of tension we want to emphasize between the condition of displacement and then the status of being a refugee formally, right? And we'll talk about the various processes to get to that formal status, or the things that prevent somebody from getting to that status, even if they fall under the condition.
And I think to further on that tension, we're going to go through a few other terms for sort of other labels or statuses of displaced people, and all of them share the condition of being a refugee, but they don't all have the status of refugee, which affects the things that they have access to, affects the services that they can request, affects their ability to gain permanent residence in a country that they have fled to. And so there is this, I think for us as people of faith, a tension between the sort of general notion of refugee and what the sort of world in the United States says, you get help, you might get help later, and you don't get any. And so some other terms, asylum seeker. And so an asylum seeker, which is a term I feel like we hear a lot now, is essentially, so seeking asylum is leaving your first country and seeking asylum in a second country. And in some ways, it would be the sort of step 2 prior to being a refugee resettled into a third country. So someone whose request for sanctuary has yet to be processed or is still being processed. So when you flee your own country and seek sanctuary in another country, you are then seeking asylum, which would then eventually grant you the right to be perceived, recognized as a refugee, have legal protection against removal, material assistance, and an asylum seeker is still in the process of demonstrating that their fear of persecution in their home country is well-founded. Internally displaced people are people who have not crossed a border yet, or at all, to find safety. So they are displaced in their own country but cannot return home. Stateless people are people who do not have a nationality or whose nationality has been stripped from them and can struggle to access basic human rights because this nationality has been taken away. It can occur for several reasons. Discrimination against particular ethnic or religious groups. I think of the Rohingya in Burma, who are some of the world's most persecuted people, who are being subjected to genocide by their own government based on gender. Emergence of new states or transfers of territory between existing states, decolonization, and gaps in nationality laws. Then there's humanitarian parolees, so someone who is otherwise sort of inadmissible into the United States. Certain countries or certain conflicts will merit this sort of status of humanitarian parolee that grants no permanent safety. It's a temporary status, and they may be able to access some benefits but not others, and are generally not considered on a pathway to permanent residence in that country, but they're allowed to temporarily enter into the United States and granted some protections. Similarly, so we're sort of working our way down now in terms of the levels of support you receive from our government. Temporary protected status is a temporary immigration status, and the only thing it does is prevent you, or it used to prevent you from removal. It did not necessarily even grant you the right to work. You would not necessarily be granted an employment authorization card. You were not eligible for benefits like food stamps and Medicaid that refugees are eligible for, but it just meant, we know it's really bad at home, so we're not gonna let you stay here forever, but we promise not to send you away yet. Which of course, you hear the scorn in my voice. We're seeing a real erosion of the sort of sanctity of those statuses right now. Special immigrant visa is another term you may have heard, and that's a special status that is actually in some ways a fast track to permanence. It grants permanent residence in the US to individuals who aided the US government abroad, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so SIVs travel here as refugees, but are immediately granted permanent residence in the United States. And I think it was the sort of military and government's way of saying, we know that you supporting us in these protracted conflicts renders you unable to stay there any longer, and we understand that we owe you. And so after the fall of Kabul in 2021, there were many folks who were just awaiting the sort of final step of their SIV status, and those were, the SIVs were sort of the top of the list for the airlift out of Kabul. Another one that we're not going to talk much about today, but we'll talk about in the third week, is unaccompanied children, which is a minor under 18 years old who enters the country without a parent or legal guardian and lacks lawful immigration status. And so for years, this has occurred primarily at the southern border. Folks traveling to fleeing violence in home country or fleeing extreme poverty and traveling without their parents, and they're placed into the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So those, I thought it was helpful to understand the word salad that we use and these distinctions that we make between people who share the same condition of refugee.
And of course, the kind of fundamental aspect of all of this is a migrant, somebody that crosses borders, right? So we can kind of think of the idea of a migrant as the broadest framework of somebody crossing borders, and then if that's forced displacement, then you have various other divisions and then kind of claims of protection under that. So I say that in terms of forced displacement, there are over 122 million displaced people around the world. That means that over 1 in 100 people around the world right now are displaced from their home. And that includes internally displaced people. Often, internally displaced people are the most common. And of course, this happens in the US. I don't want to make it seem like this is a faraway thing, right? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, we had how many thousands of displaced people in the US that sought refuge in Atlanta and Florida and such. So you don't necessarily have to cross an external border to be displaced. There are roughly 37.9 million refugees in the world. And again, these are people, therefore, that have received formal refugee status by the UNHCR or another UN body. And about half of them are children. And if children are kind of born in displacement, they go through a similar kind of refugee process. They get, cards and papers and such. Between 2018 and 2023, 2 million children were born as refugees. 71% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, which often do not have the infrastructure to support them. So the majority of refugees around the world are hosted by the neighboring countries of the conflict. So this is why Lebanon, for example, has the most refugees per capita globally, because it shares a border with Syria. The majority of these refugees are Syrians, some are Palestinians historically. Turkey and Jordan, which also borders Syria, carry more overall number of refugees, but those countries are much larger than Lebanon as well, so they have a bit more capacity. But I want to emphasize this, when the so-called refugee crisis, for example, was hitting Europe in 2015, about a decade ago now, you might remember, this is really, I think, when we saw the rise of the kind of nationalist movements, narratives that we see today, targeting not just migrants, but refugees specifically. These numbers were paling in comparison to the countries bordering these conflicts. In 2021, close to half of all refugee children, 48% remained out of school, and refugees may spend years and even decades living in camps. It's common to have generations growing up in these camps. We have a number, on average, the experience of displacement is 17 years. That's an average, which means for some it's shorter, but for some it's much longer. We're talking about generations that have been inherited and born in displacement. And so off of that, I want to kind of explore maybe briefly what is a camp. We hear the word camp a lot. We could have a definition that it's formally a demarcated space for refugee residents. There are kind of borders associated with it, often administered by a non-governmental organization like UNHCR or another humanitarian group. And we see images like this. This is Zatari camp in Jordan. This is, for the longest time, this was like the image of the Syrian refugee crisis in the Middle East, but in Jordan. See how massive it is? It's very grid-like. These are initially tents, and then maybe more permanent structures will be installed. And this, over time, we see this all over the world. Over time, these kinds of camps become towns and cities and suburbs and such. But it often will start, if it's formally administered, as tents like this with provisions. You have millions of people here, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, I should say. And of course, life continues. So you have stores and even restaurants that develop. You have networks that develop for marriage and such. Life continues, education and schools. But not all countries have formal refugee camps. So in Lebanon, even though it holds the most refugees per capita, there were regulations put in by the Lebanese government to prevent permanent residence of Syrians. So there are no formal refugee camps like I just showed that are grid-like and such. Instead, you have a wide number, thousands of informal tent settlements, they're called, technically in Lebanon. This is an image of one that I took. This is kind of the most pristine kind of PR image of a camp that you can have. This was taken on a tour. There are many informal camps that I visited, and I saw that you're kind of in the crevices of life in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, this agricultural landscape. And so there's an infrastructure, for example. So the way that, in my research, I explore the role of water in shaping political life in Lebanon. The way that residents get water is entirely through trucking of water, which is actually very costly and leads to a lot of other problems when you're trying to remove the water, desludging the water and such. So in an effort to prevent permanent residence, it leads to all these other problems of off-grid life. When you have refugees living in Lebanon for now 14 years, Syrian refugees. So at the same time, when you have generations of camps, you have like this. This is taken in Lebanon as well. This is image of the borders of a Palestinian refugee camp called Burj Barajneh in the suburbs of Beirut. And you can see the kind of dense pocket down here of the Palestinian camp. These borders were created by a UN body just after the creation of Israel in 1948, the displacement of Palestinians. And the borders haven't changed since that time, so that's why there's a density of life. And then surrounding it are suburbs that have developed in the past 50 years, 5 decades, with the expansion of the suburbs. And so you can kind of see the density of life, but also this is technically a camp, right? This urban sprawl, this dense urban sprawl with concrete and such. So some kind of key takeaways so far of this session that we want to emphasize that for the refugee condition, it's often a protracted one. It's not an immediate within a few months, displacement is over. Often people are stuck in displacement for a number of years. A reason for that we haven't, I realized, touched upon in these slides, and we'll talk about resettlement next week a bit more, but the process of resettlement is dependent on quotas that host countries have, right? So you have European countries, America, the places we imagine that refugees are resettled to, that have every year a quota that they themselves set. It's not imposed by the UN, for example. It's kind of seen as a form of hospitality and generosity that the country offers. And based on that quota, it leads to the kind of availability of course, like refugees that can be resettled in the country, but also increasingly it leads to the kind of number of refugees that can be imagined globally in many ways. So there are various restrictions on a global level to even achieve the refugee status, right? And I can talk about the politics of that, for example. In Lebanon's not a signatory of the 1951 convention, so they're not obligated to provide protections to Syrians. And after a few years of accepting Syrians crossing the border, they stopped the formal registration of refugees. So after 2015, all Syrians that were entering Lebanon could not claim refugee status, even though they are experiencing the same form of displacement as every other Syrian before them, right? So these things are highly political, they're contingent, and in the US, right now under Trump, he dropped the quota of refugees down to 0. So technically in the US, there are no new refugees because we haven't kind of created the capacity for refugees.
Well, and just to tag on that, and again, we'll talk way more in depth about this next week, but it's not just that the quota has been set to 0. The new administration terminated the resettlement contracts with every single resettlement agency in the United States and closed all of the US-run refugee processing centers across the world. There is not in the globe an active operational refugee processing center for US resettlement. And because, and again, more to come next week, hopefully this is tantalizing everybody to come back, is the process of resettlement takes years and multiple security clearances that are time-bound. And so what we have done now does not just stop the people who were meant to travel this quarter, next year. Everybody who is in the pipeline is going to see whatever level they had reached in their clearance expire and be placed back to 0. And so it will honestly, I mean, not to be doom and gloom, it will take years to build back an effective resettlement process in the United States because of everything that has happened now.
Yeah. And that's on the kind of resettlement side, the host country side. But I also want to emphasize if displacement is a condition, not a status that we were talking about, right? It's one where living at home is untenable for various reasons. Displacement isn't just a result of war and violence and these punctuated moments of displacement that we see, but it's also the kind of eroding of protections of everyday life that allow life to continue, allow a life of dignity to continue and such. And so the refugee crisis in many ways it's revealing to be a crisis of poverty on a global level. That countries that whose people are leaving the country, for example, or host countries like Lebanon, don't have the financial means to care for their own citizens or displaced neighbors, right? And this leads to kind of profound degrees of nationalism that are targeting migrants and refugees living in the country. It's leading to kind of a cascade of other problems, right? So in many ways, this is increasingly a economic problem of the forms of wealth inequality that are very kind of stark between the global north and the global south, that makes life increasingly untenable in the global south. So we, in some ways, in our imagining of what a refugee is or what forced displacement is, should consider displacement beyond simply war, but also the economic conditions that make living in a place untenable for oneself and one's family.
And we'll talk more in the third session, but I think that's particularly important because a lot of times the rhetoric we use here in the U.S. about folks generally who are crossing at the southern border, coming from Central and South America, we call them economic migrants. And I would argue and offer for your consideration and reflection for these next few weeks to think about in what ways that might demean the viability of their claim to seek safety here. Because when we label someone as an economic migrant, there is, intended or otherwise, a tone of sort of opportunism. But extreme poverty is a form of violence. When you cannot eat, you are imperiled. And so I really like to emphasize that point because of my work with asylum seekers from the southern border. I think there's this sort of hierarchy of acceptability that has kind of taken place in the zeitgeist here, where sort of refugees are coming the right way and asylum seekers might sort of be coming the right way, but you better not jump the line. And if you can't eat, then of course you would run like hell to find a place where you could provide for yourself and your family. And to me, that's no less valid a claim to seek than UN-recognized refugee status. So I wanted to throw out some verses for us to consider today. You know, bring God into this. God has been with us in all of this at every moment of today, but to bring it to Scripture and then end with a brief litany that I found. And the opening prayer was so perfect to lead us in to this moment. And so just sort of want to read through all of these and invite everyone to sit and ask yourself, where am I touched? What in me is moved in these verses? And where do I see it today? Where is God in this moment today with the strangers seeking safety in other lands? So in Deuteronomy, we're told, you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The psalmist tells us, the Lord watches over the strangers. He upholds the orphan and the widow, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. Jesus tells us, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. We're told to contribute to the needs of the saints and to extend hospitality to strangers. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. And I can tell you, based on my lived experiences working directly with newcomers, I have met angels. I'm getting a little... I have had my life so richly blessed by every person I have ever encountered. And if it's been a brief moment of accompanying someone at the airport to help them fly, to be reunited with their families, or somebody I've walked alongside for months as they worked to make a new life here, every single person I've encountered, even the disgruntled clients who are mad I'm not paying their rent, have blessed my life and made it richer and made it culturally richer. And brought so much beauty into my life. So I hope this will be, is this visible at all? Or can people see this? Okay. Well, those who can, I think Peter and I will take turns being leader. That's okay. And then the bold pieces that are P for people, you're invited to join, and I'm sorry it's not bigger. So those who can see, say it loudly for your friends who can't see. And this is from the United Church of Christ. Love them. O God of the wandering Israelites, refugees in a harsh land, who heard their cries for freedom, comfort, and refuge. Forgive us
for having hearts as hard as Pharaoh's, when we resist your calls for care and mercy for those who have fled or are fleeing violence.
O God of the psalmist, who hears the lament of those surrounded by death, destruction, and fear,
give us the strength to embody the land of the living, where refugees and asylum seekers can safely begin life anew.
O God of the Christ child, whose own earthly parents were forced to flee the state-sanctioned violence of Herod and find safety in a foreign nation, give us
hearts like the people of Egypt, to offer not only refuge but welcome to those who arrive at our doorstep in need of safety and protection.
O God, who calls us to offer welcome to the stranger, just as we would offer it to Christ.
Remind us today and every day that we need not fear what we do not know, but are freed by following your gospel call to welcome.
O God of all people, of all nations, and of all the earth, protect this day those in need of safety. Put a salve on the souls of those grieving the loss of home, family, loved ones, and memories.
Give us the conviction to offer welcome, safety, Christian love, and a space for new beginnings to refugees and asylum seekers. Instill in our hearts the courage to love as Jesus taught us, in a world that encourages suspicion, fear, and scarcity.
O God of all sojourners in search of refuge,
We ask you to create peace in this world,
so that none of your children live in places endangered by violence and civil unrest.
we ask for comfort for all who have been forced to flee their homes, and we ask that those in need of peace and protection find both refuge and welcome. We give you thanks this day for refugees and asylum seekers in our midst, and for the blessings they bring to our families, churches, communities, and nations.
Amen.
I think that we have maybe just a couple of minutes for questions. We've got a vestry meeting coming up at 12:30, so we may be transitioning some technology to the other side of the room, but our speakers will be here to answer a couple of questions. I wanted to say first, your acknowledgement of the prayer. I just want to give credit where it's due. The prayer that I opened with today was written by the Bishop of Minnesota, a gentleman named Craig Loya, who is very active in migration ministry within the church. And so I just want to credit him, and then thank you, Paul Henson, who is the person who forwards me everything spiritually meaningful that I am.
Paul's really
y'all
good
make
at
a great team. And also thank you to you both. I feel like in the face of such crisis, we sometimes feel like we don't even know where to start. And I think what you've given us today is a starting point. This education, this framework is going to be so helpful to us going forward. So I hope that you will plan to come for the next 2 weeks and to continue with us at Epiphany in our refugee ministry as we continue this work over the months and years to come. We're so grateful for your partnership and for your passion for this work. Thank you both. Okay, 5 minutes for questions, and don't pay attention to this because I'm going to be moving it while y'all are here. Okay, go ahead and unplug it.
Please, yeah.
used to sponsor refugees. Is this something that we will be discussing at some point?
Absolutely.
Because I think it was very important for all of us.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Can I jump in and
Yeah,
just add
jump.
something about this? Epiphany still has been supporting refugee families. I think it is the case in a lot of church communities when you are supporting families and walking with them on that long walk of hospitality, that your group of volunteers, which starts out really broad when people are setting up an apartment and getting settled, sort of necessarily narrows as people begin to form really deep relationships with the family. So Epiphany has continued to support the Keel family from Afghanistan, and so 2 of our most active members are continuing to work with them, Aaron and Ellen. But their work has become focused particularly on the Keel family, and so it is our hope that this sort of education and some programs that we're planning with Inspiritus, where Alex works, will help us to sort of raise awareness about the work that we're doing again and give more people the opportunity to engage. But our work is ongoing, and you will be invited to more opportunities soon.
And we'll definitely talk more about some of the concrete opportunities, because just because there's no new resettlement happening does not mean there's not a host of people on the ground who still need assistance, and we'll talk a lot more about that next week. But the executive orders that have happened since January 2nd have really made the resettlement process for the people who came a week before January 20th very difficult. And so I think there are still ways for us to offer accompaniment, hospitality, and the long walk of welcome, even if it's not sort of surrounding one new family on their singular resettlement experience.
Are there any liaisons between your organizations and the school systems?
Yes.
Are there liaisons there?
Yes, I manage that team. So we do have, most clients that we resettle live in Clarkston. I think most people are pretty familiar with the city of Clarkston. Just outside 285, most refugees are resettled there, and so we have long-standing relationships with DeKalb County schools, and so I run an after-school program that is for high schoolers at Clarkston High School, or refugee youth, but we also have a school liaison who, part of our core service when resettling new families is ensuring they are enrolled in school and helping families, like helping the parents feel empowered to participate in their kids' education. And we're lucky that DeKalb County Schools has a really robust international student, their welcome center where they sort of do assessment and placement for new students and intensive ESL. They're amazing. Now, our work with unaccompanied children in rural counties of Georgia, for kids with no status, not so great.
I think Peter, yeah.
We opened with a poem, and I just wanted to quote maybe 5 lines from 2 poems by an American poet in our lifetime, who's well known, and that would be Robert Frost. And first, from the poem we probably all read in high school, "The Road Not Taken." The last line is, "And I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." And I think that's one way of describing the experience of migrants. And then his poem, "The Death of the Hired Man," we're talking about home. And Frost writes, home is a place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And I wish that were the philosophy of our government.
Wow.
From your mouth to God's ears, my friend.
Bobby, did you have
I just wanted to say, I think that the prayers you gave us at the end and Carmi's opening prayer, it might be a lovely thing for us to take with us. through Easter as part of our Easter practice. So if we had copies, that's on, I'm sorry not to say.
You can get them
great.
too, because I already have.
That would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bob? did you-
I was just wondering about the dreamers and where they fall in the status and just the definition of the dreamers. And I don't want to start it just as quickly as you can in 10 words or less.
So Dreamers is also DACA, so Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it's basically no status at all. I guess you could lump it in with temporary protected status because currently DACA recipients, so children who were brought by their families to the United States who live here without status but came as children, we've made the argument, a good one, that it would be inhumane to send them to their sending country that they have never once resided in and for whom they may not speak the language. So DACA recipients do currently hold a form of temporary protected status, which prevents them from being removed to their home country, but that is under dire threat right now.
And they've been here like 10 years. And stuff.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
20. I mean, I
Yeah.
work with a gal who has been here 23 years. Yeah. Anybody else? I think Vestry needs us to get out of here so we
Okay.
can start. Thank you all so much. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Truly.
No, we have a really good team.
You said you were nervous. Hey,
I'm Paul, OBC.
Peter. Nice to meet you.
Great presentation.